The White House recently sent another tranche of US military aid to Ukraine worth around $250 million. This is the last funding available without fresh congressional approval, and that has not been forthcoming. The stalled counteroffensive in the east of the country and a little changed front line as echoes of 1916 in France. As a result, some European countries are also becoming more hesitant about throwing more money and weapons at Ukraine. Recently, a $50 billion aid package from the EU was blocked by Hungary. The Ukrainians are facing a $40 billion budget deficit, and officials say they may have to delay salaries and pensions for government employees if further aid from the West does not come soon. Delay, as we all know, is government speak for we're out of cash. The Deputy Prime Minister, Yulia Sverdrenko, confirmed this in a recent interview with the Financial Times. This is the financial reality. You might recall, shortly after the war started, the Western narrative was to bleed Russia dry, to bankrupt them, to exhaust them, and maybe even topple Putin. They don't talk about that anymore. Putin seems more secure than ever, and their armaments industry is on a war footing. We now have the choice to continue throwing good money after bad at Ukraine or stop. We have that choice for a short while longer, but then other realities will come into play. Ukraine is running out of men for the meat grinder. They've recently started conscripting 60-year-old men. These are not the actions of someone who's winning a war. Germany did this with the Volkssturm in 1945. Early in the war, there was a great deal of magical thinking. Putin was an evil gangster, true enough. Putin was the aggressor, also true as far as it goes. This narrative never really asked the next obvious question as to why, but people ate it up. When you mentioned eastward NATO expansion, you mostly got blank looks. Nevertheless, we pretended Ukraine could win. We pretended that Ukrainian forces would drive victoriously and throw the evil barbarians back to the borders and then stop in some way. Well, maybe they were going to drive them on to Moscow. The end game was never really spelled out. People had Ukrainian flags all over their social media. Zelensky was a darling. He was the new Churchill, and definitely not a corrupt kleptocrat installed in a CIA coup. The fact that Ukraine was previously recorded as Europe's most corrupt nation was conveniently forgotten, and news coverage parroted government statements wholly uncritically. If you questioned anything, you were a Russian stooge, you were a Putin apologist, you were a conspiracy theorist. Ukraine was going to win, and we were going to give them the money and weapons to do it. Now, early in the war, the Russians made some very bad mistakes tactically. This happens to Russia in wars, and any military expert worth his salt would know this. They started the First World War very badly. The 1940 incursion into Finland was a disaster before they finally won through, by weight of numbers. And early in Barbarossa, they sustained massive casualties through tactical naivety, but were able to bounce back. And so it's proved here. The early errors, the tank losses have been replaced with new tactics. And now it's the Ukraine that's bleeding. They don't like to officially admit losses, but a recent leak suggested they've suffered over 400,000 infantry casualties. For a country the size of Ukraine, this is crippling. Ukraine has about half the population of the UK, so this is the per capita equivalent of the British Army suffering 800,000 casualties. That's getting close to our entire casualties in the First World War. Just let that sink in. It's the equivalent of about 4 million casualties in the US Army. To put that in some kind of perspective, the US lost 45,000 troops in Vietnam, and it gave them a decade of generational trauma. Ukraine has per capita lost about 10 times that amount in 2 years. We've killed this country with false hopes and empty promises. So why did we do it? Well, it was the ridiculous idea that by opposing Putin, we wouldn't be appeasing him as we with Hitler, and we would be preventing World War III in some way. These people seem to believe the Polish guarantee over the Danzig corridor was a smart idea. I think a more likely explanation, along with a sort of atavistic hangover antagonism towards Russia, is provided by Smedley Butler. War is a racket. A great many people have made a great deal of money from this conflict. There's been almost no accountability or trace on where the money has gone. But you can be certain that Ukrainian politicians have pocketed some directly. You might see newly retired Western politicians getting speech-making fees from Ukrainian state institutions and non-executive directorships from weapons manufacturers. As always in human affairs, follow the money. The fact that the dollar bills are drenched in blood seems not to bother them at all. We were also told to believe the obvious lie about Nord Stream. I won't go into detail here, but suffice to say, the idea the Russians blew up their own infrastructure they could simply have turned off is nonsensical. Respectfully, if you believe that, you probably shouldn't vote anymore, because nuanced adult concepts are clearly beyond you. Pretty much any time a war breaks out, there are calls for ceasefires, peace conferences, etc. And in April of 2022, a negotiated settlement was available. Not only would Ukraine have lost far fewer men, they still controlled Mariupol at the time. The deal on the table was far better than anything they'll get now. The deal was blocked either by Boris Johnson, the Americans, or a combination of the two. Now, even the Americans are accepting that Ukrainian victory is a fantasy and the war will end with a negotiated settlement. Nothing in what I've said should imply that I think Putin is a good guy. He's not. He's a greedy, murdering gangster. But we have to be realistic and not engage in magical thinking. Ukraine never had the infantry or the capacity to win the war. They've lost a generation of men for what? The West has thrown $100 billion in aid down the drain. We've poisoned relations with Russia for a generation and strengthened the Russia-China and Russian-Iran axis. We've even provided foreign currency for the North Koreans. This is yet another foreign policy disaster to follow Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Lebanon, Syria. So please, do me a favor. The next time the television starts telling you we need to attack someone to defend plucky country X against evil country Y, stop and think. It's most likely a corrupt lie to impoverish you via taxes, to murder foreigners in wars, and to further enrich our corrupt, greedy, murdering political class in the West. These people are our real enemies. So, with such a disastrous track record, perhaps it's time we stopped voting for them. If you like this, please like, recommend, and subscribe.